So hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to talk about our defences and how we build them and what they look like when we come from a narcissistic family or a dysfunctional family. So I'll refer primarily to narcissistic families and narcissistic parents, but this information is also applicable to people that have come from dysfunctional families. So by dysfunctional, I mean maybe the parent was an alcoholic, or they had mental health issues, or they had their own trauma that they hadn't dealt with, they hadn't processed themselves. So this is going to affect their behaviours on a daily basis and then therefore affect their children. So I will talk primarily about narcissistic families, but this can be applicable to you if you come from a dysfunctional family but your parents aren't narcissistic. So what happens to a person's brain, body and psyche when they've come from a difficult background and when they've come from a background where there's been a narcissistic parent? So this does have profound effects on brain development and the nervous system and the way the child develops their personality and their psyche. So I'd like to explore all of those things in this video, and then hopefully at the end you may have a better understanding of yourself if you don't already know some of the things I'm going to talk about here. So let's have a look. So when we are born into a narcissistic family or a dysfunctional family, the foundations upon which we're trying to build our belief system, our sense of ourselves, and our view of reality are really unstable. They're also ever-changing because there are no rules, so to speak, in a narcissistic family, are there? So something that's fine on one day, there can be a really extreme reaction to the next day. So when we're growing up in a narcissistic family, we're trying to build a functioning model, a sense of reality, a sense of our reality and how we're relating to ourselves and to the world. An environment that's changing daily and hourly. So we're trying to establish a foundation there, which is impossible to do in a narcissistic family. So we can liken it to building our psyche, which we can imagine like a house on sand. So the foundations are really unstable. And this is an unstable foundation to stand on in life, isn't it? So this is why people from narcissistic families can have a sense of instability and fragility, a sense of they might be able to fall apart at any moment, a sense of people trying to annihilate them or destroy them. They may have passive suicidal thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, not being able to cope anymore, feeling like life's not worth living. And they can feel empty or like part of them is missing. And they can lack a sense of self. So they might think, I don't really know who I am. I don't really know what I like. Those kind of thoughts. So nothing really feels solid, and it all kind of does feel unsure. It feels unstable, feeling unsure of yourself or unsure in life in general. And this instability means that when something happens in daily life, like an argument with someone, a confrontation, or something going wrong in some way, then this can really feel like it's shaking those foundations. It can feel really unsettling, like a wave is coming in and unsettling those foundations in the sand. Or it can feel like a storm. We can imagine it like that. So a storm has happened in our lives and then things become unsettled because of those shaky foundations. And then it's a sense of waiting, isn't it, sometimes for stability to come back in or for those feelings to settle down and calm down. And this can be something that we don't feel we have any control over. So we kind of have to wait for the unsettled feelings to pass. Some people can do meditations and deep breathing and help themselves to calm down that way. But then at other times for those people and for other people, there can be no sense of relief when doing meditations or breathing exercises or trying to calm themselves down. They just feel on edge, unsettled, hypervigilant, nervous until some time has passed and those emotions settle down again. And sometimes it can take a few hours, sometimes it can take days for those emotions to settle down. So how do we help ourselves to feel stable when our sense of reality is built on an unstable foundation? And how can we stop ourselves from falling apart if we have that feeling, or the feeling of trying to keep sane? And for some people, they may have had those feelings of instability and suicidal feelings and feelings of falling apart and everything being unmanageable in their childhood years or their teenage years. But then they can manage to build quite solid defences against those feelings in adulthood. So you may not feel that unstable in adulthood, but that will have been there in childhood years. So how do we stabilise our psyche when the foundations it is built on are unstable? So we can imagine it like a house being supported by scaffolding. So the foundations are shaky, but we support our psyche with that scaffolding, which is like a stabilising structure. So these are our defences. So they can be things such as minimising what happened. They can be denial, which is a really common one that people use. It can be being hypervigilant. It can be having an addiction, so a shopping addiction, an addiction to scrolling on TikTok, for example. It can be drug use or alcohol use on a very regular basis that keeps that psyche feeling stable. So these things help us to manage our internal world and keep our psyche together. So why does our psyche feel so unstable, and why sometimes do we feel like we don't understand ourselves and our mood states or our mood changes? Or why do we do what we do? We might question sometimes, why did I do that? Or I don't know why I did that. I don't understand myself. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel like me. That's not me to do that, but it's something we've done. So it is us somehow, isn't it? And why do we have that fear of falling apart? So this is because of the unstable foundations, but it's also because of other factors that I'll go into now. So another factor in this is how the brain and the nervous system develop in response to the ongoing dysfunction that is living in a narcissistic family. Growing up in an unstable environment is dangerous and it's frightening, isn't it? And especially the behaviours in a narcissistic household from the narcissistic parent are so abusive, critical, rejecting, abandoning. These are really terrifying experiences for a child to live through. So we have to adapt ourselves in terms of our survival techniques. In a narcissistic household, our emotional needs are not met or looked after. We may be physically looked after in terms of clothing and housing and food, but then the most important part, which is the emotional needs of the child and the need to be loved, is not taken care of. And every situation is different. So for some people, both parents are narcissistic. For some people, one parent is narcissistic. The other parent might be more codependent and softer. So there may be love from one of the parents and harshness from another one, but still the environment is dangerous, isn't it? But everyone's experience is different. So we all have different coping mechanisms. We all have a different mental makeup and a different psyche and a different system. So we can call it a system of defences. So this system of defences develops out of that dysfunctional childhood. So how does it develop? So here I'm going to use the word trauma. A lot of people don't like this word. A lot of people feel uncomfortable with it and they think maybe perhaps what they went through wasn't trauma. But if we think of it in terms of the effects that it does have on the brain and the nervous system and the way it fragments it, then we can see it as trauma in that way. But lots of people, they're uncomfortable with that word, or they minimise what happened to them and they think, it wasn't that bad. Or they have feelings of self-blame, which are triggered when they start to think about their childhood. So they might think, I was, a difficult child. Lots of it was my fault. And they may think of it in that way. So these can all be defences that protect us from looking at how hard it was. So I will use the expression trauma here. But if you'd like to think of it like dysfunction or difficulty or use another word that you feel more comfortable with. So let's have a look at the setup of the brain and how the brain works. So here we can see the triune brain. The brain can be roughly divided into 3 sections. The frontal lobes are the thinking brain, which reasons, problem solves, remembers facts and tells stories, and it's rational. The limbic system, or the mammalian brain, is the section of the brain which holds emotional experiences and feelings and the traumatic memories of trauma survivors. And the reptilian brain is at the heart of our instinctive responses and bodily functions, such as digestion, heart rate, and our breathing. And then here we can look at the brain's response to threat. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for solving problems, verbal communication, and reasoning. And it goes offline, so to speak, when under threat. Triggered feelings can become overwhelming and it becomes hard to think logically. The limbic system, or the mammalian emotional brain, perceives and reacts to threat, holds non-verbal emotional experiences and traumatic memory. And the brainstem, or reptilian brain, controls our instinctive responses and bodily functions, such as heart rate and breathing. This responds instinctively to signals of alarm from the amygdala. So what is the amygdala? The amygdala is in the limbic system and it's the fire alarm of the brain. And in traumatized people, it's swollen, which they've seen on brain scans, and it is primed to respond to threat. It is also the emotional memory center. It responds to triggers in the environment. So we can see the different function of different parts of the brain there, and then we can see what happens to the brain when it's feeling under threat, which parts are working and which parts stop working. And another factor here is the split in the brain. So we have our right brain and our left brain. When we're in our early childhood, we're mostly in our right brain. So the functions of the right brain are non-verbal language, perception of emotion, sensation, and facial expression. And these are also our survival responses there and our emotional memories. And then as we're growing up, our left brain is developing. And this side of our brain is responsible for logic and reasoning and analytical thinking, carrying on with life, coping and functioning, and also verbal and narrative memory. So what else is important here is understanding the nervous system. So the nervous system is a control system that acts largely unconsciously, regulates bodily functions such as heart rate, digestion, etc. And we have 2 parts of our nervous system. So we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is to stimulate the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the defenses of freeze and submit, and these shut down our system. And here we can see the emergency stress response. We have fight and flight, which results in increased heart rate, rush of energy. That front part of our brain switches off, that's responsible for logical and reasoned thought. So it doesn't interfere then with our responses, does it? Because we need to make split-second decisions that are really quick. And then for our freeze and submit response, that can show itself in shaking and trembling, exhaustion, numbness, and collapse. The brain goes through various growth periods during childhood. It also undergoes pruning. This is when neural pathways which are less used are eliminated. Pathways which are used frequently become automatic. Therefore, ongoing trauma or dysfunction results in the brain and the body developing patterns of automatic responsive behaviours which best enable survival. And this is called procedural memory. Procedural memory starts working right from birth. And we can see procedural memory at work in our adulthood as being able to drive a car without thinking about what we're doing, riding a bike without thinking what we're doing. Those automatic behaviours and responses to the environment. And how does trauma show up in our procedural memory? So it can show up in our thoughts, feelings and behaviours in various ways. So socially traumatised individuals might find themselves finding it difficult to maintain eye contact, and then maybe when they have made eye contact they look down or they look away. So this is a learned submissive response. Then they may view themselves as being inferior to others, They may have social anxiety, especially in larger groups of people. So many people prefer just to be in a smaller group with one or two other people because there are not so many other people to watch and be hypervigilant of, and it feels much more comfortable. Emotionally, they may often be numb and shut down or agitated and angry. Sometimes emotions can be overwhelming. And sometimes emotions can feel like they're coming up and taking over and there's no logical control over them. And behaviourally, traumatised people may often find themselves wanting to be alone or being unable to say no to other people for fear of upsetting them. Lots of people pleasing and a preference for being alone because then it just feels safe, doesn't it? We don't have to be hypervigilant about thinking what other people are thinking, how they're viewing us, if we're upsetting them, if we're making them angry. You know, for people that self-blame a lot, being with other people can cause lots of social anxiety, lots of feeling of discomfort. So they may be aware of these quite consciously, or they may be aware of them only subconsciously. But even things that we know subconsciously, they're influencing our conscious behaviour, aren't they? So emotions are the language of the body and the psyche, and they protect us from danger. So we can see how trauma affects the brain here. So we have the personality before trauma, and then in that right and left brain split, we can see that the left-hand side of the brain is the self that's carrying on with normal life, trying to function, and dissociates itself from the trauma. And then we have the emotional self, which we can think of as the right side of the brain. This holds the traumatic feelings and memories and the responses which enable survival. So this is that procedural memory. Then we can think of this as primary dissociation, when there's maybe one traumatic event like a car accident. Then we have secondary dissociation. So this is when we have our self carrying on with normal life, trying to function on a day-to-day basis. And then we have our emotional self, which holds the traumatic feelings. And then the emotional part of the personality continues to split into more compartmentalized defenses as a more complex system is needed for survival. So here we can see our fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attachment defenses. And then tertiary dissociation, this is when the self that carries on with normal life also splits into more parts. So more parts are needed to survive dangerous conditions. And the carrying on with a normal life self also divides into parts which are holding resources. So these are survival resources. So the more dissociation that happens, the more fragmented the self becomes. So here we can look at the dissociative spectrum. So at one end we have someone who hasn't had trauma and they're more integrated. So they can see dissociation in themselves in terms of daydreaming, being able to be really focused on an activity or a task and being unaware of their surroundings in that way, driving a car, being in a trance-like state because you don't need to think about what you're doing. And then at the other end, we have a very fragmented psyche where we have DID, which is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be known as multiple personality disorder. In the middle, we have PTSD and complex PTSD. And then a bit further down, we have personality disorders. So these are different levels of dissociation. So Van der Hart, Van der Kolk and Boone say, dissociation refers to a compartmentalization of experience. Elements of an experience are not integrated into a unitary whole, but are stored in isolated fragments. Dissociation is a way of organizing information. So to enable us to carry on with life and to function, then we need to repress and file away some of the trauma. And we can think of this compartmentalization like a honeycomb. And I take this image from Meredith Miller, who has a YouTube channel and it's called Inner Integration. And she has some videos on when she went to South America and she took some ayahuasca. And she has a narcissistic mother. And what she experienced there was the real cold, mechanical, loveless functioning of a narcissist brain, the loveless life that they're leading. And also she saw the trauma happening, and it was like a honeycomb where memories and feelings go into separate compartments, and then the walls around each of those feelings and experiences then is like an amnesiac wall. So they're filed away. There's an amnesiac wall around them, so they're not in our conscious memory. And this is how the brain copes with trauma in its amazing way, by filing stuff away. So we can think of it like that. And what else is important to know is that when we've been through trauma, our nervous system and our brain remain primed for danger at all times. So when we do have a level of dissociation, what this means in practical terms is that we have our going on with normal life self, and then we have these mood states or defenses, however you want to look at them, that will be triggered and they will come up and take over, and they're part of our survival responses. So this can be why people can feel like they don't really know who they are, because sometimes they feel really angry, sometimes they feel really submissive, sometimes they feel really people-pleasing, sometimes they're frozen, sometimes they're having a panic attack, sometimes they just need to be drunk or taking another kind of substance so they're not in their own body because they're not comfortable in their own skin. So we can feel like lots of different versions of ourselves, and this is due to these responses, defense responses, that kind of become autonomous. So tying all this together, we have our right and left brain, where we have our emotional world, and then in the other half of the brain there's the more practical world, which is concerned with functioning in daily life. Then we have the triune brain, and we've seen that when we're triggered into a defense response, we are acting from our reptilian brain, and our logical reasoning brain goes offline. We've seen as well procedural memory, how our defense responses become ingrained in our neurons as automatic responses to the world that we don't have logical control over. Well, our reptilian brain is the logic there. And then we've seen in the emergency stress response how we're triggered into fight, flight, freeze or submit, and then the different characteristics around that. So what happens when our body's primed for danger and our brain is primed for danger is that we're mostly going to be in those triggered states of fight, flight, freeze and submit. And we're going to have a narrow window of tolerance. So a window of tolerance is an idea from Dr. Dan Siegel. You can look him up if you'd like to. And it's talking about how there's quite a narrow window here where we're feeling comfortable and we can think clearly and we can reason and think with our logical mind, and everything's working in harmony together. But because the world feels a dangerous place and we're primed for danger, then this window of tolerance is narrow and we're often out of it. So we're either in a hyper-aroused state or a hypo-aroused state. And we've also seen how the psyche is built on sand, so to speak, so the foundations of it are very unstable. So ideally, we want to move to a place where there's a very solid foundation and we can dismantle the scaffolding of our psyche. That is our defences. So how do we do this? We can get to know ourselves better and develop self-awareness of the different mood states of our different defences when they come up, and use grounding techniques to calm ourselves down. So a grounding technique brings us out of that automatic response and into the here and now, and can help to calm everything down, and they signal to the nervous system that there's no danger. So the feelings of the self being fragmented are due to having an unstable foundation, and then also this dissociation that can happen, this fragmentation of the defences. And a really interesting book to read here is Janina Fisher's book, and it's called Healing the Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and she explains really well there the whole structural dissociation model. And she's been working in trauma for 41 years, something like that. So she has a lot of experience with working with traumatized clients. So let's have a little look now at each of these defenses and what characteristics, behaviours and thoughts, beliefs go with each one, so that you can better get to know yourself when you are in a triggered state. And to learn how triggers work, you might want to watch my video, Triggers and How They Work, which explains that a bit more in depth. So let's have a look at fight, flight, freeze, submit and attach and what they look like in practical terms. So for fight, the emotions that go with it are anger, aggression, suspicion, rage, mistrust, indignation, indifference, being haughty, being hypervigilant. The body language is narrowed eyes, a still face. So it's just watching, isn't it? There can be muscle tension in the shoulders, arms and the back. There can be sudden anger, a judgmental voice, violent dreams, suicidal, self-harming behaviours. It can be impulsive, devaluing, destructive. Its thoughts can be that I should have done something. It can think about weaker parts of the self as you are weak and needy, putting us in danger. And it can think that other people don't care. Triggers can be separation or authority figures, being close to people, being dependent on people. It can feel like a wounded teenager and it doesn't want to remember the trauma. It's phobic of being calm, successful and happy. It's self-destructive, and one of the purposes being self-destructive can serve is that it stops us attaching to other people. It keeps other people away from us, and it can't problem solve. So our flight response, this can have the emotions of feeling trapped, distant, suspicious, unsafe, a feeling of needing to get out. Some people always like to know where the door is, so they kind of have an escape route planned. Body language can be restless legs, fidgeting, sitting on the edge of a chair, looking away towards doors and windows, so as if they're ready to run at any moment. Their behaviours can be sitting close to doors and windows, eating disorders, addictions. They can't commit to people or situations. They feel ambivalent. They like to have an emotional distance between them and other people, and they like to run. The flight parts of us have the thoughts of don't let anyone get too close. I have to get out of here and I don't want to feel. And triggers can be too much emotion. The flight parts of us are also opposed to remembering, aren't they? We're running away from ourselves basically with flight behaviours. And then the addictive behaviours can inhibit attaching to other people as well. The freeze parts of us, these can have the emotions of fear, terror, wariness and anxiety. There can be the body language of being frozen, breathing can stop, the body can be stiff, the eyes can be quite wide, and there can be a look of fear. Behaviours can be obsessive compulsive behaviours, panic attacks, being agoraphobic, general anxiety disorder, phobic of being seen, being agitated and having scary dreams. Thoughts and beliefs of those parts can be that it's not safe to be seen. There can be the fear of I thought I would get killed. Triggers can be loud sounds, wide open spaces with nowhere to hide. And fear is often a communication from freeze parts. Submissive parts, these can have the emotions of hopelessness, helplessness, self-loathing, ashamedness, depression, worthlessness and despair. The body language can be shoulders rounded, the inability to make eye contact or sustain eye contact. The head can be down and there's an unthreatening, appeasing posture. The behaviours are passive. They're the good child, the good person, so wanting to people please and be seen as good. They're taking care of others, so putting their own needs last and putting other people's needs first. They can go numb. There's a hopeless internal voice. And there's an inability to say no. So this is part of the people pleasing. Thoughts and beliefs that go with submissive parts are that it's all my fault, I'm less than others. There's a fear of annihilation. There's a belief that if you have needs, that other people will be angry about you having those needs. Submissive parts think, do what other people want and just be quiet. Just go along with it. And it was my fault and I deserved it anyway. Triggers can be criticism, a sense of expectation and frustration. And it can be felt as aches and pains in the body, overriding feelings of hopelessness. And sometimes when we're submissive, when we go into these submissive compliant behaviours, this can trigger fight and flight in us. So we go into submit and then this makes us want to drink, go into an addictive behaviour. We can want to run away or we can start to get angry. So we can be angry at that submissive behaviour in ourselves and it doesn't feel safe. We may feel someone is taking advantage of us. Then attached parts, they can feel the emotions of grief. There can be a fear of abandonment. There can be yearning for someone to come. There can be longing to be close to someone. They can feel unlovable, lonely, sad, anxious, desperate. They crave being rescued and they crave attention. There's separation anxiety and they can feel needy. The body language can be, there's a shy look, a soft childlike expression, seeks closeness to others, and the body can sometimes orient towards sources of help. So we might have our feet and our knees and our head pointed towards what we feel may be a source of help. Behaviours can be that they're sweet, charming, dependent, childlike. They can be very forgiving of attachment figures, and that can be because to attach to someone who's frightening and abusive, we need to be forgiving, don't we? And self-blaming to enable that relationship to happen. Otherwise, there's a fear of death, isn't there, at the end of it, because you can be abandoned and rejected, and then this means trouble, doesn't it? And thoughts and beliefs are, help me. If I function, no one will help me. No one loved me. No one will ever love me. And it wants comforting. Triggers can be rejection. So the whole of our survival system can see attach as too dependent, and this can trigger fight. Switching into another defense relieves the distress of that emotion. So that longing and loneliness of those attached parts might feel overwhelming. And if we then switch into fight where we're feeling angry, that can distance ourselves from those emotions, can't it? And attach was used to serve adults' needs in abusive households, wasn't it? So that was used against the child and exploited by the adult. Coming to understand ourselves is half the battle when we've come from an unstable childhood and we do have these feelings that we still feel in adulthood. We don't understand ourselves very well. There are those feelings of instability and needing to hold on to sanity. Being triggered into mood states like anger, having an addiction, and other behaviours that I've talked about to do with fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach. Understanding those is half the battle in recovering from trauma and developing self-awareness of those different parts of ourselves and being able to differentiate and then come to understand them helps us to reintegrate those fragmented parts of the self. And I will do a video on healing from trauma. That will be my next video. And it will explain how it is possible. Sometimes it can feel like it's all too overwhelming and that there's no way out, but there is a way out. So I hope this video was useful for you and that you've learned something that maybe you didn't know before. Take care of yourselves and goodbye. Bye.